Okay, story time. I'm not so comfortable talking about the crystals of consciousness and the sort of more mystical as well as more sometimes scientific or pseudoscientific aspects of human design, simply because if someone gives me their time, I want them to come away from that with something practical, with something useful, right? That's the whole fifth line thing. You come to me and I give you some practical tools and I give you some practical things you can try out, you know. And if you are a fourth line, I say it's very impractical for you to work with people that you wouldn't share a drink with or break bread with. You should only work with your friends. It's only practical. It's impractical for the fourth line to not be friends with their coworkers or their employees or their superiors and so on. And so, you know, and I have that for all of the types and so on. But when it comes to the crystals of consciousness, there's not much practical here, right? There's not that much, you know, knowing about it. It's really the cosmic fairy tales, as Ra called them. Cosmic fairy tales is a different thing. And so I can tell some fairy tales, but how much of it is mythically true, how much of it is literally true, how much of it will someday be demonstrated in science, I mean, and so on. And even if it is all figurative truth, what are we supposed to understand these figures, you know, relating to? And also a lot of it does seem quite literal. And I may even, in some cases, take things overly literally, more literally than Ra meant. So there's a lot of complexities here. We're kind of fraught with complexity. But I'll give it a try. Okay, so what got me on this whole tangent of thinking about the crystals of consciousness and wanting to make a video on it was trying to describe mutation in the mutative fractal lines and what a fractal line is, right? And basically, I see fractal lines as occurring over history, over time, the same repeated personality crystals encountering themselves again and again. And they belong to a certain echelon, which we could even signify by an index of their degree of differentiation or separation from the source of that mutation. And that mutative source is none other than the Big Bang itself, which, this is what Ra says in the Ray of Cosmology materials, was basically a shattering of the prime personality and design crystals. Now, I'm not going to go into the complexity that the actual personality crystal is kind of a pseudo-personality crystal, because that's another part of it, is that we have not yet actually had any real personality crystals, but that part of it is so complex and it's kind of beside the point. What we call the personality crystal shattered into the 16 prime personality crystal bundles when the Big Bang occurred, when the prime personality crystal collided with the prime design crystal, which broke into the design crystal bundle, the single design crystal bundle. And this point of collision was not in the exact middle of any coordinate system. Excuse me. First of all, we're not talking about atomic matter. The Big Bang certainly occurred at an atomic level, but the collision of the crystals, these are non-atomic. These are dark matter. So there's a lot of models now of the universe that don't include dark matter, and, you know, people think maybe someday they'll be able to even eliminate the idea of dark matter. But I don't think so. I don't think so because I think Ra was onto something when, or at least in his interpretation and understanding of his experience with the voice, he interpreted that as signifying that there were these dark matter crystals that kind of simultaneously, and this is not his words but my own interpretation, through almost something like Leibniz's pre-established harmony or parsimony, effectively are able to mirror each other, the dark matter and the atomic world. Not really mirror, but rather the neutrino is the one way of communication. It's the communication layer between dark matter and the atomic world as the only atomic particle that also has a dark matter correlate, and therefore, you know, I don't know exactly if this is true, but it sure seems that way. Okay, so going back to Big Bang. So the Big Bang is this collision. Well, the point of the collision was not the middle, right? It's not like the center of the personality crystal and the center. I mean, it was the center, but as Ra says with his delicious quizzical nature, he goes, the center is not the middle. And isn't that true of mutation? Just at a simple level where we just think of, if you're trying to mutate and you're in the center of a non-mutative group of people who are 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 degrees removed from that mutation, like degrees of separation. If you're, in that group and you're trying to mutate, they're going to be preventing that. The mutation can't take hold in the middle. The center is not the middle, because the center of the mutation is the edge. The edge where the personality crystal and the design crystal originally collided. So what happens then is it shatters these personality crystals, and then Ra does the calculation that only 4% of the total number of crystals are actually on the inner circle. That works out to 1 in every 600 people, roughly. That's like a fifth or a sixth. I think it's a sixth of 1%, somewhere in there. So when you realize that those personality crystals are the only crystals that were on the mutative edge and therefore have the most mutative potential, then you have the second degree mutation. They still have mutative potential, but they're a degree out, and then the third and the fourth and so on. And he said it's always like this, The first Muslims were mutants, and then by the time it is now, you have people who've completely misunderstood and bastardized the beliefs, same for the first Christians, the first, of any faith, religion based on mystical prophecy, based on all this stuff. The prophecy itself was a mutative core, and the people having the prophecy were people like you and me, probably, if you're watching this video, because we tend to find each other again and again, life after life. Because see, the human design reincarnation model is that the design crystal is only used once, but the personality crystals were used again and again and again. Now, it's my assumption that actually it's far less than 1 in 600 people living today that are actually part of that inner mutative circle. But it's far more than that 4% of 4%, or 1 in 600, that are actually capable of benefiting from human design. However, the level that they benefit will be dependent on their proximity to the mutative core. And at a certain point, they're not going to be interested anymore, right? They just won't. They'll be more interested in QAnon. Just like Ra uses the example of somebody who blows themselves up thinking they'll get 70 virgins, as somebody who's 20 or 30 degrees removed from the mutative core. You even see how contemporary Jungians, people at the Zurich Jung Institute in the 90s, were only 1 or 2 degrees removed from Jung. And yet, even just that separation from that mutative moment, and that Jung was able to share with people like Edinger and von Franz, but not with his successors, which is why Jung said on his 80th birthday, shortly before his death, that all the people who'd been invited to the birthday brunch at noon who were esteemed Jungians, he said, "Thank God I am Jung and not a Jungian." I think he must have actually said that earlier. But no, what he said is, he said, they will not. It was that night, and he had invited over his groundskeeper's family and his neighbors and the peasant people and the hill folk. And, he said, these people who are here tonight will continue the Jungian tradition. They will continue my work, because the people who came, who are scholars of my work and historians of my work, and call themselves Jungians, to paraphrase, they're just practicing Jungianism. It's like Hegel, no, it wasn't Hegel, it was it Nietzsche, who said, "You who dare call yourself a philosopher, you are no more than a mere historian of philosophy." I was thinking of Hegel because he did so much as well on the history of philosophy and history of thought, but on how it's not enough to simply be a historian. You have to yourself embody that mutation. So it's obvious to me that all of the figures of Western history were figures from very mutative times and places. Now, there is institutionalized racism and so on because of the seven-centered reality that we are evolving out of, and the weight of the seven-centered reality. And because of that, there's been a lot of erasure and omission of black and or indigenous and/or people of color throughout history. However, it's my firm belief that there have always been, black and/or indigenous and/or people of color present throughout historically mutative times and places. And you actually find that mutation, that there's always been this mixing of cultures and of genetic material and backgrounds and so on. So whether we're talking about the student protests of May 1968, or we're talking about the French Revolution, or we're talking about any of these historic moments, there's, always been this mixing going on. Okay, but in any case, so the human design model in terms of the cosmic fairy tale is there was this, the Big Bang that created the universe. The universe is ever expanding since then. And as it expands, these crystals of consciousness are actually, always moving outwards too. But they're always staying effectively at their position in relationship to the mutative event of the Big Bang. In other words, you never get closer or farther away. However, what I wondered is, what if one of these incarnation crystals stops reincarnating? Because that's happened more and more and more and more in the last few thousand years, especially as we have had things like cremations and destroying the bodies and all this stuff that's happened that has left rogue crystal bundles everywhere. There have always been some, but, since the first person died and then had their body disturbed, or was not able to have their full Bardo experience, and got lost and wasn't picked up by the prime crystal bundle. I'm going into rave cosmology material, which not everyone might be familiar with, but in any case, my point is, it's my assumption that there are far less than 1 in 600 people who are actually there for front row seats for the Big Bang, so to speak, right? Because a lot of those people over history have not reincarnated. They've been picked up by rogue crystal bundles, so it reduces it. On the other hand, I wonder if when one of those doesn't reincarnate, if the next outer ring, so to speak, moves forward, or if there's just a gap. I'm not really clear on that point in terms of the kind of unbroken chain of information transmission from the mutative source out into the collective. Seems to me that chain can and does break. It's not really an unbroken chain. And that's one of the things I love about human design, is that it really does show the deterioration, even at the metaphysical level, that corresponds to what we would normally notice as, something rusting or something breaking, right? Like the actual gates themselves are breaking. I love that. 1949 is about to split and no longer be a channel. I love that. Human design is so fascinating in that it really does represent a living metaphysics, where the metaphysics itself changes in a way that so many classical ontologies did not. So, to wrap up the kind of cosmic fairy tales, there's this 4% of 4%, or 1 in 600 people, at any given point in time, whose personality crystals were at the most mutative position since the beginning of time. And every life that they come in, they are mutative. Okay, so what does it mean to be one of those people? Well, first of all, I'm assuming I'm one. I'm assuming you're one. I'm assuming, most of the people that I communicate with are in that group. Because when you actually look at the world at large, it seems clear to me that it's around 1 in 600 people who does self-select to be part of some sort of vanguard or the other. But what I think happens is, no matter where they find themselves, you can go to any college. They might be the only mutant there, or there might be 2 or 3 mutants there. Or there might be a lot of mutants if it's like Reed College, because that's a mutative hotbed, right? I'm calling them mutants if they're let's say first or second tier. So they're not just, it's not just 1 in 600. Maybe it's more like 1 in 60 people is capable of hanging. And, within that, 1 in 10 of those people are going to be the kind of leaders of the mutation and the ones who introduce the mutation to their 10 followers, you could say. Not necessarily followers, but, compatriots. So it's just my assumption that we are these mutative people. And first of all, there's questions also about, isn't that arrogant to assume? And my good friend Mike was like, when you keep saying that we're at the center of the mutative hierarchy, how do you know? And it's like, well, because there's a lot of ways to tell. And there's a kind of a mutative highest echelon of pretty much any field you can imagine. For instance, the Santa Fe Complexity Institute here in Santa Fe is absolutely, those people, at least the vast majority of them, are part of this 1 in 600 mutative, 0.0016%, or however much it is, right? And so they're part of that 0.0016%, or the next outer ring. And it's going to be like that at every field. If you go to, the Mesro in Lower East Side Manhattan,